The metal clamps bite into flesh. Adamantium burns through bone. Logan's screams echo through the laboratory as machines drill into his skeleton. But the scientists don't stop. They can't stop. This is Weapon X, where pain became the price of perfection. But how did we get here? Marvel's obsession with human enhancement didn't start with torture chambers. It began with a simple question that's haunted science fiction for decades. What would it take to create the perfect human being? Today, we're ranking Marvel's most evil human experiments using 3 brutal criteria. First, human suffering. How much pain did subjects endure? Second, scientific feasibility. Could this actually work with real science? And third, results. Did the experiment achieve its goals? And at what cost? Leave your like, subscribe, and let's get into it. Let's start with the experiment that created Captain America, Project Rebirth. On the surface, Steve Rogers' transformation seems almost wholesome compared to what comes later. Dr. Abraham Erskine's super soldier serum, combined with Vita Ray exposure, turned a scrawny kid from Brooklyn into the perfect human specimen. But here's what makes Project Rebirth fascinating from a scientific standpoint. It's actually the most realistic enhancement we'll discuss. The serum targets multiple biological systems simultaneously. Think of it as extreme gene therapy combined with controlled radiation exposure. The Vita Rays don't just zap Rogers randomly. They activate specific genetic pathways that the serum has prepared. In real-world terms, we're looking at something like advanced anabolic enhancement crossed with epigenetic optimization. Modern science is already exploring ways to activate dormant genetic potential through targeted therapies. The military has spent decades researching performance enhancement, from modafinil for sleep deprivation to experimental gene therapies for muscle growth. What went right with Project Rebirth? 3 things. First, Rogers volunteered. He understood the risks and chose to take them. Second, the conditions were controlled. Erskine wasn't working in some basement laboratory. This was a legitimate government program with medical oversight. Third, it had a clear moral purpose: stopping the Nazis. But here's where the moral calculus gets complicated. Rogers was the only success. Every other attempt to recreate the serum killed the test subjects. Isaiah Bradley survived a later version, but barely, and the other African American soldiers in that program died horrible deaths. The government kept trying to reverse engineer Erskine's work, and people kept dying. When Erskine was assassinated, his formula died with him. That single death created a cascade of unethical experimentation that continues today in the Marvel Universe. Governments, corporations, and mad scientists have spent decades trying to recreate what Erskine achieved, usually without his moral constraints. The real tragedy of Project Rebirth isn't what it accomplished, it's what it inspired. Every failed super soldier program that followed can trace its origins back to this one successful experiment. The Winter Soldier program, Weapon X, even the Flag Smasher's stolen serum. They all exist because someone saw what Steve Rogers became and decided they needed that power for themselves. Project Rebirth scores low on human suffering because Rogers consented and survived intact. It scores high on scientific feasibility because the biological mechanisms are theoretically sound. And it scores moderately on results. One perfect success that spawned generations of catastrophic failures. Project Rebirth final ranking, B tier. High scientific feasibility and moral framework, but the cascading failures it inspired prevent it from reaching the top tier. When the US government lost Erskine's formula, other scientists tried to rebuild it piece by bloody piece. That's where our next experiment comes in. The Weapon Plus program didn't start with Logan. It started with the simple realization that if you can't recreate Erskine's serum, maybe you can build a super soldier a different way. Take someone who already heals fast, then break them down and rebuild them with better materials. Logan wasn't a volunteer. He was a test subject who happened to have a healing factor that made him nearly impossible to kill. That healing factor became both his salvation and his curse, because it meant the scientists could do things to him that would kill anyone else. The process was simple in concept, horrifying in execution. Coat every bone in his skeleton with adamantium, a fictional metal harder than steel. The problem? You can't just dip bones in molten metal. You have to inject the liquid adamantium directly into the bone marrow while the subject is conscious. Why conscious? Because the healing factor only works properly when the nervous system is active. Picture this from a biological standpoint. Your bones aren't solid. They're living tissue filled with blood vessels and nerve endings. Now imagine injecting molten metal into that living tissue. The adamantium doesn't just coat the bones, it fuses with them at the molecular level. Every injection triggers massive trauma as the body tries to reject the foreign material. But Logan's healing factor kicks in, rebuilding tissue around the metal even as it's being destroyed. The result? Constant regeneration under extreme trauma. His nervous system is essentially being rewired in real time as his brain tries to process pain signals from bones that are simultaneously dying and healing. The science behind this is actually more feasible than you might think. We already use metal implants in orthopedic surgery, titanium joints, steel rods, mesh inserts. The body can adapt to foreign materials if the integration is done carefully. But Weapon X wasn't careful. They were essentially performing full skeleton replacement surgery without anesthesia on a conscious subject. Real-world parallels to this kind of experimentation are darker than you want to think about. During the Cold War, both Soviet and American researchers conducted pain-tolerant studies that pushed human subjects to their breaking point. The MK Ultra program included experiments designed to break down personality and rebuild it from scratch, exactly what Weapon X did to Logan's memories. The psychological component makes this even worse. They didn't just rebuild his skeleton, they rebuilt his mind. Memory implants, false histories, programmed responses. Logan became a living weapon who couldn't remember who he used to be. His healing factor kept his body alive, but his identity was systematically destroyed and replaced. The results were exactly what the program wanted: a nearly indestructible killing machine with retractable claws and enhanced senses. Logan could survive injuries that would kill normal humans, track targets across impossible terrain, and eliminate threats with surgical precision. From a military standpoint, Weapon X was a complete success. But the human cost was catastrophic. Logan spent decades as a mindless assassin, carrying out missions he couldn't remember for organizations he didn't choose to serve. Even after breaking free from the programming, he's haunted by memories of kills he can't fully recall. The healing factor that saved his life also trapped him in an endless cycle of trauma and recovery. Here's what makes Weapon X particularly evil. The scientists used Logan's healing factor as an excuse to torture him. They convinced themselves that because he could recover from anything, the pain didn't matter. They turned his greatest gift into a justification for their cruelty. Weapon X scores maximum points for human suffering because the entire process was designed around inflicting pain. It scores moderate points for scientific feasibility because metal-bone integration is theoretically possible, even if the execution is barbaric. And it scores catastrophic points for results because while they created an effective weapon, they destroyed a human being in the process. Weapon X final ranking, A tier. Near maximum evil due to deliberate torture and complete destruction of human identity, held back only by moderate scientific plausibility. But some scientists weren't satisfied with rebuilding existing humans. They wanted to create entirely new forms of life from scratch. After Hydra's fall, most Nazi scientists faced justice or disappeared into hiding. Arnim Zola chose a different path. He decided to transcend humanity entirely. What makes Zola's experiments particularly disturbing isn't just what he did to his victims, but how he treated human bodies as raw data to be manipulated and stored. Zola's post-war research focused on three interconnected goals: consciousness transfer, genetic recombination, and what he called biological data storage. He wasn't trying to enhance humans. He was trying to replace the concept of humanity with something he could control completely. The science behind Zola's work involves cutting-edge concepts that are becoming frighteningly realistic today. Consciousness upload requires mapping every neural connection in a human brain, then recreating those patterns in a digital environment. We're already seeing early versions of this with companies like Neuralink developing brain-computer interfaces. His cloning techniques went beyond simple genetic duplication. Zola was creating hybrid organisms, part human, part machine, part something else entirely. He would take genetic material from multiple subjects, combine it with synthetic DNA sequences, and grow new organisms in artificial wombs. Think CRISPR gene editing taken to its absolute extreme. where the goal isn't to cure disease but to create entirely new species. But here's what makes Zola's experiments uniquely horrifying. His test subjects weren't volunteers or prisoners of war. They were civilians he kidnapped specifically for their genetic profiles. Families would disappear overnight, only to reappear months later as twisted combinations of their former selves. The process started with complete genetic mapping. Every cell in the victim's body would be cataloged, their DNA sequenced, their neural patterns recorded. Then came the modifications. Zola would alter their genetic code while they were still alive, watching how their bodies adapted to the changes. Some subjects would develop extra limbs. Others would lose the ability to feel pain or gain enhanced senses that drove them insane. The consciousness transfer experiments were even worse. Zola would use subjects conscious during the process, forcing them to watch as their memories and personalities were copied into his computer systems. He claimed this was necessary for maintaining neural pathway integrity, but the real reason was simpler. He enjoyed watching them realize they were being replaced. Real-world parallels to Zola's work are emerging faster than most people realize. Digital brain mapping projects are already underway, attempting to create complete neural models of human consciousness. Synthetic biology companies are designing organisms that have never existed in nature. The technology Zola used fictionally is becoming scientifically possible. His subjects experienced suffering on multiple levels simultaneously. Physical pain came from genetic modifications, psychological trauma from watching their bodies change against their will, and existential horror from having their consciousness copied and stored like computer files. The results were exactly what Zola wanted. He achieved a form of digital immortality, uploading his consciousness into computer systems where he could continue his work indefinitely. His hybrid creations became weapons and test subjects for further experiments. From his perspective, the project was a complete success, but the human cost was staggering. Entire families were reduced to genetic components and digital ghosts. Zola had essentially industrialized the destruction of human identity, treating people as raw materials for his scientific ambitions. Zola's experiments score extreme points for human suffering because victims endured physical, psychological, and existential torture simultaneously. They score moderate points for scientific feasibility because the core technologies are rapidly becoming possible, and they earn warp success points because Zola achieved his goals even though those goals were fundamentally inhuman. Arnim Zola's genetic abominations final ranking, A tier. Extreme multi-level suffering and complete dehumanization, with emerging real-world feasibility making this terrifyingly plausible. But Zola's legacy would look almost quaint compared to what happened when someone decided to apply similar techniques to an entire population of genetically gifted individuals. Nathaniel Essex didn't start as a monster. He started as a Victorian-era biologist obsessed with Charles Darwin's theories of evolution. But when he encountered apocalypse in the 1800s, Essex made a deal that would turn his scientific curiosity into something far more sinister. Literally, Mr. Sinister's experiments represent the ultimate perversion of genetic science. While other Marvel villains focused on enhancing individual subjects, Sinister took a much broader approach. He decided to perfect the entire mutant genome by controlling who lives, who dies, and who gets to reproduce. His techniques read like a nightmare version of modern fertility science. Sinister would identify mutants with specific genetic traits, then manipulate their lives to force them into breeding programs. He didn't just want to study mutant genetics, he wanted to direct mutant evolution according to his own twisted version of perfection. The Summers bloodline became his masterpiece. Sinister spent over a century manipulating Scott Summers' family tree, orchestrating marriages, deaths, and births to create what he considered the perfect genetic combination. Jean Grey wasn't Scott's love interest by accident. Sinister had been guiding their relationship since childhood, believing their offspring would possess unprecedented psychic abilities. From a scientific standpoint, Sinister's work is disturbingly feasible. He was essentially performing large-scale genetic engineering before the technology officially existed. Today, we have CRISPR gene editing, pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, and reproductive technologies that could theoretically accomplish everything Sinister did. But Sinister's methods went beyond selective breeding. He created clones, dozens of them. The Madeline Pryor clone of Jean Grey was just one example. Sinister would take genetic material from his target subjects, create multiple copies with slight variations, then study how different environmental factors affected their development. His laboratories were filled with growing chambers containing partially developed clones at various stages of maturation. Some were allowed to develop normally, others were subjected to accelerated aging, and still others were kept in suspended animation for decades while Sinister monitored their genetic stability. The psychological manipulation was just as systematic as the genetic control. Sinister would place his subjects in carefully orchestrated situations designed to trigger specific emotional responses, believing that trauma and stress could activate dormant genetic potential. He treated human emotions like laboratory variabilities to be controlled and measured. Real-world parallels to Sinister's work are uncomfortably close to historical atrocities. The Nazi eugenics programs attempted similar genetic control through forced sterilization and selective breeding. Modern concerns about designer babies and genetic discrimination echo Sinister's belief that some genetic combinations are inherently superior to others. His victims experienced suffering across multiple generations. Parents watched their children disappear, only to discover years later that those children had been replaced with clones or genetically modified versions. Entire family lines were manipulated without their knowledge, their most intimate relationships orchestrated by a madman with a god complex. His genetic databases contain detailed profiles of thousands of mutants, their powers, their weaknesses, and their breeding potential. Sinister's experiments score near total points for human suffering because the pain extended across multiple generations and affected entire family systems. They score high points for systemic feasibility because genetic manipulation and cloning technologies are rapidly advancing. And they earn long-term catastrophic results because, while Sinister achieved his scientific goals, he created genetic chaos that continues to cause suffering decades later. Mr. Sinister's mutant experiments final ranking? S tier. Generational trauma, high scientific feasibility, and systematic destruction of entire bloodlines represent the pinnacle of scientific evil. When Sinister industrialized his obsession with genetic perfection, the entire mutant population became collateral damage in his quest for evolutionary control. What happens when an entire nation decides that genetic superiority is a matter of national policy? Genosha answered that question by building a society where mutants weren't just test subjects. They were a renewable resource to be harvested, controlled, and optimized for maximum economic output. Genosha wasn't a laboratory. It was an entire country designed around the systematic exploitation of mutant genetics. The island nation built its prosperity on a simple premise. Mutants were too powerful to roam free, but too valuable to simply eliminate. Instead, they would be controlled, bred, and used to fuel a genetic empire. The machinery of oppression was both high-tech and brutally efficient. Every mutant on the island wore power suppression collars that could deliver pain, unconsciousness, or death at the push of a button. These weren't just restraints. They were behavioral modification devices that monitored vital signs, hormone levels, and even brain activity to detect signs of rebellion or escape attempts. The breeding programs made Sinister's family manipulations look amateur by comparison. Genosha's scientists didn't just control individual bloodlines. They managed the entire mutant population like livestock. Mutants with compatible powers were forced to reproduce, their children immediately separated and raised in state facilities designed to maximize their abilities while minimizing their humanity. The science behind Genosha's control systems draws from real-world behavioral pharmacology and biosurveillance technologies. The power suppression collars worked by disrupting neural pathways specific to mutant abilities, essentially jamming the brain signals that activated superhuman powers. Modern neuroscience is already developing similar techniques for treating epilepsy and other neurological conditions. But the collars did more than suppress powers. They monitored everything: heart rate, brain activity, stress hormones, even genetic markers that might indicate developing abilities. The data was fed into massive computers that tracked every mutant's physical and psychological state in real time. Any deviation from acceptable parameters triggered immediate punishment. The breeding programs used principles that mirror modern reproductive technology, but applied them with the moral framework of factory farming. Genetic compatibility was determined by computer algorithms that analyzed thousands of variables: power types, genetic stability, physical health, even psychological profiles. Children born into this system never knew freedom. They were raised in dormitories, educated only to perform their assigned functions, and conditioned from birth to accept their role as tools of the state. Their powers were developed through systematic training that bordered on torture, pushing their abilities to their absolute limits regardless of their physical or psychological cost. What made Genosha particularly horrifying was how normal it all seemed to the people running it. The scientists and administrators genuinely believed they were building a better society. They had convinced themselves that mutants were inherently dangerous and that strict control was necessary for everyone's safety. The breeding programs weren't seen as atrocities. They were viewed as scientific progress. The parallels to real-world genocides are impossible to ignore. Genosha used the same techniques as history's worst regimes: dehumanization through classification, systematic separation of families, forced labor, and the reduction of human beings to their biological functions. The only difference was that Genosha's victims actually did possess the dangerous abilities their oppressors claimed to fear. The results were exactly what the architects of Genosha intended: a prosperous nation powered by controlled mutant labor, with a new generation of genetically optimized subjects ready to serve the state. The economy thrived, the technology advanced, and the ruling class lived in luxury built on mutant suffering. The mutant rebellion that eventually destroyed Genosha was both inevitable and catastrophic, leaving the island in ruins and its population scattered or dead. Genosha scores ultimate points for human suffering because the pain was systematic, generational, and designed to be permanent. It scores chilling points for realism because every technique used has been employed by real-world regimes throughout history. And it earns absolute failure points because despite achieving short-term success, the system ultimately collapsed in violence and destruction. The Genosha mutant breeding camp's final ranking? S tier. Industrial-scale genocide with proven real-world precedents represents the absolute worst of what happens when scientific capability meets systematic dehumanization. From serum to genocide, Marvel's science fiction exposes the real responsibility behind every experiment: the choice between seeing subjects as people deserving of dignity or as resources to be exploited for someone else's vision of perfection. Across every experiment we've examined, one constant emerges through all the pain and scientific ambition. The pursuit of human improvement always came with human loss. Whether it was Steve Rogers volunteering for an untested serum or entire populations reduced to genetic resources, the price of enhancement was always paid in suffering. The disturbing truth is that real-world science is catching up to Marvel's darkest imagination. CRISPR gene editing, consciousness mapping, cybernetic implants, and reproductive control technologies are advancing faster than our ethical frameworks can adapt. The line between fiction and possible keeps getting thinner with each breakthrough. What Marvel's experiments reveal isn't just the horror of unchecked scientific ambition. It's the fundamental truth that scientific power, without empathy, always ends the same way: in ruin. Every villain we've discussed started with good intentions or logical goals, but lost their humanity somewhere in the pursuit of perfection.